The drama of most Undercover stories comes from one of two questions. Either, will the hero fall for the lifestyle of the villains they were meant to bring down? Or, will the big bad discover that the protagonist has been on the other side all along? These stories begin with the main character's reason for going undercover. For some, it's just the job they're assigned. Others are told that if they don't, then they're going to jail for similar crimes. And a few find themselves with no other choice, if they want to live. But it seems to always come down to the two questions. Will they succumb, or will they be found out? In the first option, the hero wants to stop the bad guys out of the goodness of their heart. But as time goes on, the comforts of criminality get a little bit too enjoyable. Temptations abound, and the perspective of the big bad starts to make sense. What once was black and white becomes nothing but shades of gray, eventually leaving the protagonist with the question of whether or not they should switch loyalty, whether or not they should join the side they were originally meant to thwart. The second option shows a hero who doesn't struggle with the morality of it all, but rather revels in the precariousness of the situation. Intelligent and observant bad guys catch on to the clues, and the protagonist can't be perfect every time. An unstated timer ticks ever closer to the cover being blown. It becomes more of a mental game of cat and mouse. Although the record from the Bible might not be as dramatized as these particular types of stories, the events of 1 Samuel chapter 27 actually leave David confronting both questions, as he and his men are forced to go undercover as mercenaries for hire under the eyes of the Philistines. We saw in the trilogy of chapters just previous to our passage for the sermon, the reason why David is forced to go undercover. Really, the whole time of David as fugitive from Saul gives us the reason, but the previous 3 chapters underline it. In both chapters 24 and 26, we witness Saul riled up into chasing after David. Both times the younger man proves that he means no harm to the king, the Lord's anointed. And if he'd wanted to, he could have had vengeance when he caught Saul in a compromising position both times. Saul expressed regret in each situation, even promising to stop chasing David. But such a promise could only be held so long by the king who'd also failed to live up to his promises that he'd made to God. So, wisdom told David that Saul's ire would only be quelled for a time, no matter how deeply the king seemed to apologize. It would never be lasting peace as long as both lived. And in chapter 25, we saw one of Saul's supporters act insolently towards David as well. Nabal stood in for Saul's presence in that story, the king ever hanging over every interaction. There was little way for David to tell friend from foe until it was too late. Sure, God would protect his chosen king through whom he would bring a restoration to his chosen people. But that didn't mean the whole path would be easy. There were still many enemies to act like Saul in the land of Israel. And so all of his previous experience, and especially these last 3 chapters, this all leads David to make the decision that he has to leave Israelite land, acting like the exile that Saul and his supporters made him be. But will this move, even as he goes in undercover as a mercenary for hire, will this leave David to reject the God of Israel and become nothing different than the uncircumcised Philistine whose sword he bore? 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1-7. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Then David said to Achish, "If I found favor in your eyes, let a place be given to me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Take a look at the first sentence of verse 1. Do you notice something significant about David's inner thoughts? I will perish by the hand of Saul. It's stated in a tone of certainty. A thought that if David continues to follow this way of life, then Saul will certainly kill him. But more importantly, notice that the statement has no thought of God in it. This life in the wilderness of Judah was something that God had told David to do, through the voice of the prophet Gad. But David's words here betray a sense of doubt in God's promise to him, the promise of becoming king over Israel. Because if Saul is going to kill David, as the words of the verse reveal his belief, then how could God fulfill the promise of David's kingship? I mean, Saul's gotta die for the throne to be handed over. And if he's dead, Saul can't then kill David in return. So the promise has to be doubted in order for these words to happen. This is what can happen when we allow the circumstances around us to speak lies into our mind. We might have been shown over and over again that God protects and delivers, but when we've been beaten around enough by the problems of this life, those lies seem more real to us than the promises of God. And this is when we're tempted to give in to the lie. When we think we know better than the God who made us, and we begin down the road of the godless world. But that doesn't mean that God can't still use us or the situation we've walked into. He's still able to bring about his purpose through us. If we take a look at the passage as a whole, we'll see that God is never mentioned and seems to be completely absent. But if we look closer, we can see traces of his invisible hand at work in and through the story's protagonist. In his thrashing, our confused hero tries to figure out on his own how to get through this mess. He listens to the foolishness of the lie, a repeat of his tactics from the very beginning of his time as fugitive. So David heads to the Philistine city of Gath. Not only is this a stupid idea because it turned out so poorly the first time. I mean, David went to the same king and had to play a crazed pretender in order to escape, as we saw in chapter 21, with the very unique sword of Goliath in hand both times. But it's also a stupid idea because David has already been shown the tendency of those who go to the godless neighbors of Israel. In the last chapter, we witnessed him express his fear of exile from the land, a fear forced onto him by those who stirred up Saul against him, those whom David cursed, who drove him out of the land of Israel, saying, "Go serve other gods." Remember, David's words there showed us his great regret of a fugitive life. He couldn't worship God properly. I mean, the last time he'd gone to the tabernacle, Saul slew all but one of the family of the high priest. The fugitive's presence caused death by the hand of the king. So David couldn't worship as prescribed. Sure, Ahimelech the high priest was among David's camp, but that wasn't the way God commanded the Israelites to worship. And if David were to be pushed even further from the land of Israel, how much further could he move away from the worship of God and become just like the uncircumcised Philistines that he had long fought? It was a fear that could become a reality as David brought his men to the Philistine city of Gath. Will our hero succumb to the lifestyle of the Philistines? It's the question asked in this chapter where God's perspective on the situation appears absent. Yes, David's plan worked. Saul quit chasing him. But what would be the consequences for this move when he didn't ask God for directions? Consequences for David and for the 600 men whom he led. If the story were being told today, we'd probably hang out in the drama for a little bit longer, emphasize the temptations of David's time eating the delicacies of the Philistine king. Maybe we would hear the philosophical and theological perspective of King Achish. And we most certainly would not hint at the hidden hand of God through the situation brought about by the thoughts that had forgotten his promise. But the biblical author moves quickly to answer the question of David's succumbing to the godlessness of the Philistines. In verse 5, we see David ask for a place outside of direct Philistine influence. It probably took a little while for him to earn Achish's trust to reach this moment. But in great wisdom, David phrases it in a way that makes it seem like it's a good idea to Achish. Why should a servant like I take up room at your royal table? You're wasting resources on me here. Let me have some land and work for my own food. I could do the same type of job that I'm doing here and be out of your hair. This is win-win for you, O king. In this simple request, we see David reject the best things of the Philistines, in a manner which I think is very similar to Daniel later on in Israelite history, when that prophet rejects the delicacies of the Babylonians in order to keep in line with God's commands. David is not going to succumb to the Philistine way of life, in either food or philosophy. While David might be far removed from the tabernacle in Israel, he's not going to move far from God. Something which is proven in verses 6 and 7, where the author tips his hand by looking into later events. This city, Ziklag, will remain in the possession of the kings of Judah all the way to the author's present day. This means that David has to become king, return to Israel as its rightful human ruler. Otherwise, that statement couldn't be true. So David will remain true to God even as God remains true to his promise to make David king, an event which will happen after David's been with the Philistines for only a year and 4 months. This undercover job has a time limit. And it is here where we witness some of God's guiding hand in the midst of the story. God wasn't done with David just because he moved without asking. It's not like God said, "There he goes again, away from me and to his own choices. He forgot me, so I'll forget him." No, just because David's thoughts went to the worst possibility, and he acted in such a way that dismissed the direct promise of God, it doesn't mean that God left him alone to his own devices. God used this situation for his own purpose, one which brings restoration to his people, despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about. Some might be asking how I can see God using this for his own purpose, given the current passage. The passage itself doesn't seem to support this godly perspective, but in answer I would give one word: Ziklag. Maybe you want a few more words. Well, Ziklag was one of the cities in the land of Canaan allotted to the tribe of Judah during the time of the conquest, and the city would eventually be given to the tribe of Simeon, because the area given to Judah was far more than enough for them. So you see, David was given a city by Achish, which had been promised by God to the Israelites many generations ago. David's time spent among the Philistines allowed him to restore a city to the people of Israel without a drop of Israelite blood being spilt. Even though David's undercover as a mercenary in a foreign land, God is still using him for his purpose, as shown by the fact that this city God had promised to Israel was given to him without war and battle. God keeps his promise. David's life has proved it. David's not the only one who can still be used by God for his purpose after we've made a mistake. Even when we're facing our worst fears in a land surrounded by enemies, with God seemingly absent from it all, he hasn't left us to fend for ourselves. He's right there with us, waiting for us to join him in his restorative purpose. When we let the lies trample over God's promises to us, he's not sitting there judging us. He is still there, with the truth of his word, waiting for us to look to him, with arms open wide, and still able to utilize us in his good work. Those doubts, those questions, those mistakes, they don't disqualify us from working with him once we've returned our focus onto him. We can keep him close to our hearts while in the midst of a land that wants us to become just like them. We don't have to succumb to their lifestyle, their choices, their ways of life, their food or their philosophy. Even in the worst of it all, when we keep our eyes on God, we can still help him bring about his purpose for restoration. And God's promise of restoration doesn't just aid us when we face the question of will we succumb, but also the question of will we be found out. 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 8 to 12. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land, and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah," or "Against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites," or "Against the Negev of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, "He has made for himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he will always be my servant." Not only was David being used by God in the restoration of the city of Ziklag, but also in the destruction of all the peoples who had been in the land of Canaan when the Israelites first entered the land. A total obliteration of those rightfully judged by God and found wanting. Israel had been granted the position of agents of justice against those unrepentant idolaters of old. All the way back to the time of the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, there had been people whom God had justly commanded the Israelites to utterly destroy. But they had failed in that mission. They'd succumbed to the idolatrous ways of those people and let them live. One group of such people had been the Amalekites, the very same people whom God had commanded Saul to utterly destroy back in chapter 15. Man and woman, child and infant, oxen, sheep, camel, and donkey. But Saul had followed in the footsteps of his forefathers, refusing to heed the command of God. Some of the Amalekites, particularly their king, had been allowed to live. And this was one of the major failings of Saul as agent of hope in Israel. But 1 Samuel chapter 27 verse 8 shows us that David raided the lands of these idolaters from of old, those who still held lands in the southern desert belonging to Judah. David's time under cover allowed him to complete a mission of God's justice that not only had been generations in the waiting, but had been the very downfall of his predecessor as king in Israel. He did the work of God that so many before him had failed to do. When verse 8 tells us that David slew these people groups, it shows him being the agent of justice that God's chosen kings should be. Sure, verse 9 reveals that David took the oxen, sheep, camels, donkeys, and other spoils. But don't think that this gives us reason to question why David wasn't judged like Saul was for taking the same types of things. See, there was a difference between the two. David was not directly commanded by God to do the very same thing Saul was told. David's act went further back to the command for the destruction of the peoples given during the time of Joshua. Those spoils were not denied him by direct command from God, like it was in Saul's case. And the spoils also helped David in his undercover job. They allowed him to show the Philistine king that he had been out raiding. The proof was in the objects that David brought back. But this is where that second question of undercover stories comes into play. Will David be caught? Because he continually told Achish that he'd been raiding the communities of Judah that dwelt along the desert borders. All the while he was wiping out the idolatrous enemies of God, killing any and every witness among those people who could have seen what David was actually doing. No one could tell Achish differently. Again, if the story were told today, we'd want to draw out the drama. Maybe show the single time that one person escaped the slaughter, only to be assassinated minutes before they could tell anyone about what happened. Or we would have little clues and hints dropped into Achish's lap, only for David to have convenient and plausible excuses. But the author of the book shows us that David was not found out. As a matter of fact, Achish was so convinced of David's loyalty that he reveled in how much of a stench David must be to his own people. Oh, how they must loathe and hate David. All of those claims that the raids had been among the lands of Israel built a false confidence in the Philistine king, a confidence that he would one day regret. And it is here that we again see God's guiding hand in this chapter. The ploy had worked, I'm sure, in part because God nudged Achish's mind away from doubts and fears. Any question about David's loyalty met godly provided excuses. Why would God do this in circumstances like we see here? Why would he go along with David's plan when he never asked God what he should do? Because God was using this false confidence of Achish so that David could do the work of the Lord, even while among those who stood as God's enemies. God isn't confined by any limits to do his work. No power can keep him from his purpose. And even we who join him in his work can do great things in places that seem to be impossible by human standards. We can even work undercover in a place that we fear will keep us far from God. Even there we can still do his work, serve alongside with his purpose, as long as we return our gaze to God and follow his good and just ways. If we've allowed the lies to speak over the truth, or if we found ourselves in the middle of territory belonging to those opposed to our God, we need not fear that he can't work through us. He is still with us, without any limitation to his power. All we need to do is be willing to join him, even if undercover or on a cross. Then restoration can be found by his humble people, because that is his purpose, shown through his chosen king.